Okay. All right, this is the Planning Commission meeting on Tuesday, August 23rd, 2022. We'll be calling this meeting to order at 6 PM. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Stevens,
Here.
Commissioner Bedoya,
Here.
Commissioner Black, absent. Vice Chair Calindres,
Here.
and Chairman Smith stated he would be absent this evening.
Okay, we're gonna be doing the Pledge of Allegiance. You guys stand with us. Okay, is there any adjustments to the agenda?
No.
Any conflicts of interest disclosure?
No.
No.
Nope, no conflicts. So we're gonna be opening the public comment period. This meeting will be open to the public and conducted in virtual format to be inclusive to all. Participants' preference, public comments, participation is encouraged by emailing any comments to the city clerk's office or by calling using the phone number provided on the front of the agenda. Are there any public comments?
Yes, sir, I have one. Ramiro Cabrera.
Good evening. I'm here to speak on the density for some of the parcels, 419, 1700016, 1017, 018, 022, 027, 419, 1600005, and 160024. I live on 8th Street, 1523, and I represent the houses between Xenia and Allegheny. Many years ago, City Manager Bob Bounds, about 1988, came knocking on my door, and that's when we were county, and asked if I would represent those homeowners to annex them into the city of Beaumont. And I accepted, and so as far as I'm concerned, I'm still the advocate and represent those houses. I meet with the homeowners often. We are in favor, 100%, of building family units on the empty lots, which I have just stated. I want to be on the record that 100% of the homeowners are in favor of this project. Bob Bounds did tell me that as time goes on, things change. And one of the things that are going to be changing is the density. There's a sweet area, a gray area, to where you have too many units, and then the project could have used more units. So all the homeowners agree that we need to have a density to where people aren't packed in like sardines, and, you know, the person that's going to front the money to build these units in the future can get their bang for their buck. That's really all I want to say. We'll be speaking in the future on the density. Right now, I believe the density is 16 buildings, 192 units. I don't know. That's something that we'll discuss in the future. Thank you. Any questions?
I actually have a question. Sir, is the the homes that you're talking about, is that across from Sundance Elementary?
C.
Yes. So between Xenia and, you said okay, approximately how many homes are there?
There are 13 houses.
Okay. Thank you, that's all. Just wanted to clarify.
Yes, it's on the south side. We were there when the Noble Creek units went in on Xenia, very successful. I was there when the Sycamore units on Allegheny went in, and the Tuscany units, very successful. All of these are very successful projects. I understand that the project on Allegheny that's going on is for veterans. I believe I just heard that tonight. I didn't know. That's in the process of being built. Fabulous. Beaumont is shining now. We have the climate, we have the business environment. We've seen the projects go up for the Sundance industrial units, the 7-Eleven going in. Everything is groovy.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
comments.
Have a good evening.
Is there any other public comments?
Rudy, do we have any callers on the line?
We have no callers on the line.
No other comments.
Okay, so at this time, we're going to close the public comment at 6:07. And we're going to be going to item 1 in the agenda, public hearing for consideration of 6th Cycle Housing Element Update 2021 to 2029 and an amendment to the general plan and program environmental impact report. Can we get a staff report?
Yes, good evening, Vice Chair Colindres and Commissioners. Before you this evening is the first step in wrapping up the state-mandated 6th Cycle Housing Element Update, which will take us from years 2021 through 2029. As part of this process, there will be an addendum to the General Plan Program Environmental Impact Report. There is a focused update to the safety element of the general plan. There are some amendments to the land use element of the general plan, which are required for consistency purposes with the updated housing element, and some zone changes that will be associated in order to implement the housing element as well. The commission's role tonight is to hold a public hearing and then forward a recommendation to the city council, who will then hear this item on September 20th for the formal adoption process. I'm going to give a brief staff report, and then we have the consultants who worked on behalf of the city to prepare this housing element update and all the associated documents that will give a presentation that's much more enjoyable to look at and to listen to than just the staff report. So as I said, under state law, all cities, all local governments in California are required to plan to meet the housing needs. Typically, we refer to this as RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. A housing element is required as part of the general plan. When the city updated our general plan about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we weren't quite through the housing element cycle, so we deferred the housing element update until we were further down the timeline, and until we knew that the state was going to go through the process and allocate our RHNA, or our required housing that we would have to accommodate in this housing element update. Typically, these updates are every 8 years. And for the SCAG region, which is most of the cities in Southern California, again, this runs from 2021 through 2029. Lisa Wise Consulting assisted the city in preparing the draft housing element and all of the documents for this hearing. And the city followed all of the proper statutory requirements required in the government code. There are a number of assembly bills and state requirements that we have to go through as part of this, including public participation. There were a number of meetings that were held, as well as mailings that were done and community outreach throughout the last year and a half that we've been going through this process. So the draft housing element does have several mandatory components. We have to review the previous housing element. We have to conduct a housing needs assessment. And part of that, which you'll see in the staff report and you'll see again in the presentation, includes identifying what the required number of units that the city is going to be obligated to help facilitate in the next 8 years. The city's number is 4,210 units, and it's broken down into various categories: very low, low, moderate, and above moderate, based on income levels. This number is less than what the city had in the previous housing cycle by, I think, roughly 1,000 units. So we did make some progress in the last cycle. In order to facilitate implementation of the housing element, the city does have to conduct an inventory of adequate sites. So we have to look at our existing available land in the city and identify if it would be suitable for accommodating any of the required housing units. We also identify various housing resources, and we identify constraints, so things that may be prohibitive or constitute a barrier to accommodating housing or to encouraging housing to be built. And ultimately, we come up with a housing plan and programs that will help staff and developers implement the housing element and make progress towards meeting our housing goals. That is a very abbreviated synopsis, and at this point, I'll turn it over to the team from Lisa Wise Consulting to do the presentation, and then staff and the consultant will be happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Christina. My name is Jen Murillo. I'm with Lisa Wise Consulting. I'm very pleased to be here tonight to be at your public hearing for your 6th cycle housing element update. So thank you, Christina, again for that introduction and overview. The presentation I will go through will do a little brief kind of refresher info on housing elements, and we'll get into needs and conditions specific to Beaumont. And then we'll talk about the housing element itself, largely focused on what's changed since you last saw this draft housing element about a year ago, and then talk about the additional actions and what the recommendation and next steps are to wrap up this process. So just as a reminder, and Christina gave a great overview, is that the housing element is a requirement of state law. It is prescribed by state law in terms of not only its requirements and components, but when it must be updated. So it is on an 8-year cycle. And the housing element is unique in that it must be approved, must be certified by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. And we will look at and have looked at what are the housing needs for the community, conditions of existing housing stock, as well as looking at how the city will accommodate its fair share, or that RHNA number that was mentioned. The city's action plan, it's an implementation plan to cover that 8-year period from 2021 to 2029, and outlines goals, policies, and programs. Your programs are really where the rubber meets the road, and those are what will be reported against in your annual progress reports over the next 8 years to HCD. As Christina mentioned, these are the key components that are required by state law and included in the housing element. For kind of ease of the bulk and nature of this document, most of this is included in appendices to your housing element. So a review of your current housing element programs to see what's effective or what could be improved upon, a needs assessment, That looks at demographic trends, housing production trends, and identifies needs related to special populations as well. Seniors, persons with disabilities, homeless, single female-headed households, and others. We also look at those constraints. So constraints to housing production can be governmental, things that are in the city's control, fees, zoning, and non-governmental, market conditions, things outside the city's control. And then looking at that adequate sites inventory, I'll talk about that and more specifically in the presentation. And then a component that is new this cycle is the analysis of fair housing applicable to all cities within the state doing housing elements. This is a new, very critical requirement that I'll speak to specifically in the presentation to talk about what's new and what this analysis entailed. Again, noting resources to support housing as well as that implementation plan, your goals, policies, and programs. So this process began at the end of 2020, and in July of last year, we issued a public draft of the housing element for review. Since that time, we have gone through 2 review rounds with HCD. Some of that due to a late publication from HCD of the requirements and guidance associated with that new fair housing analysis component. So we spent some time with HCD completing that assessment and conducting some revisions back and forth, and are before you tonight with a revised version that incorporates comments received from HCD. So although the SCAG region, the Southern California region, had a deadline of October of last year to finish housing elements, only a handful of jurisdictions actually were able to meet that deadline just based on the increased scrutiny, additional requirements, and changing legal mandates associated with housing elements. So the city of Beaumont is actually doing quite well, on track, on par with the vast majority of all jurisdictions in Southern California with timelines on getting these housing elements done. One thing at the city's benefit is that we are packaging this hearing tonight with your zoning amendments. So that's all coming together efficiently and can be completed and adopted with the next council hearing, which does allow the city to restore compliance status in the eyes of HCD with a deadline of October for the zoning amendment changes. So long story to say, this has been a very challenging cycle, particularly for Southern California, but the city is on a good track to be compliant in the next few months. Public outreach, a very critical component. The city had a dedicated webpage for the housing element, did social media, news releases, email blasts. We did a virtual workshop and then held meetings on the draft housing element when that was released last summer, as well as providing an online comment form for comments to be easily submitted at the public's convenience. Targeted outreach was done in both English and Spanish in terms of letters to ensure that we were getting input and feedback comprehensively from all segments of the community. So again, here we're at public hearings, closing out the public outreach for the project. Briefly getting into some specific housing needs and conditions in the city. In terms of overall income distribution, Beaumont does look very similar to the county as a whole, but has a higher household median income. That being said, about a third of Beaumont households are considered to be lower income. That means they earn less than 80% of the Riverside County Area Median Income, or AMI. And when we talk about being housing cost burdened or overpaying for housing, we're describing that a household is paying more than 30% of income towards housing costs. And Beaumont residents do experience a lower rate of overpayment relative to the region, but still about 4 out of 10 renter households in Beaumont are cost burdened, are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And as would be expected, lower income households are much more likely to be housing cost burdened than moderate and above moderate income households. So this new fair housing analysis requirement, it requires us to look at much of the data that we analyze for general needs assessment in the community, but we look at it spatially. So we look at a more refined lens across the city to look at potential disparities within the city's boundaries versus just looking at the city as a whole. So the affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis is now included as Appendix F to the housing element. It's quite extensive. I'm just going to hit on a few of the points from that. So, for example, this map on the left shows, excuse me, concentration or share of lower and moderate income households by census tract. So you do see in the darker tone a higher share of lower and moderate income households kind of centrally located in the city, particularly at that intersection of the 10 and 79 or Beaumont Avenue, as well as north along Beaumont Avenue. On the right-hand side is a map of, is a opportunity map, which is published by the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, TCAC. They use these opportunity maps for ranking and prioritizing the allocation of tax credits for affordable housing development with the intent of achieving fair housing goals. So this opportunity map does look at resource, does categorize census tracts by resource, and looking at resource in aggregate based on various factors like poverty, employment, access to jobs, exposure to environmental hazards, educational proficiency, things of that nature. So what we see is that there are varying resource areas across the city, ranging mostly from high to moderate, but we do see a lower resource tract designated again at the junction of the 10 and Beaumont Avenue or State Route 79. So what this shows is that in areas where you have more concentration of lower and moderate income households, you're generally seeing them having a kind of lower quality of resource or environment within which they are living. Similarly, these next maps, the one on the left shows environmental conditions specifically, and while environmental conditions are a factor that go into the opportunity maps, we do see this alone, and do see, as you also saw actually in your health and environmental justice element of your general plan, again, this centrally located tract within the city, having a higher proportion of potential environmental hazard exposure. And this tract is the location of the historic El Barrio neighborhood, which is something that the affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis wants us to look at in terms of potential communities where we can look at an improvement in housing condition. The map on the right looks at potential risk of displacement, so potential vulnerable communities. And This looks at factors like a higher concentration of lower income households, a higher share of renters, a higher share of people of color, and other factors to identify potential areas that may be at risk of displacement. Again, we do see that same track, that the junction of 10 and Beaumont Avenue continuing to come up. But we see other areas as well, and in response to this analysis, we have put forth new programs as well as expanded and bolstered programs that we already proposed in response and to address some of these conditions. The RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation, as was mentioned, is the number that the city has been identified for demonstrating sufficient capacity for. So the city must show to the state that there is sufficient land capacity to accommodate the 4,210 allocated units across the different income levels. Now, this is an exercise in capacity. It is not that these units must be built, but that the city works towards providing these in terms of accommodating capacity and facilitating their production. So looking at the revised draft housing element in your packet, I'm so sorry. The draft housing element, again, was released last summer, and we have now made revisions based on not only public comments from residents, but from the workshop we had with the Planning Commission. We also had a study session with the City Council. But largely, we are primarily seeing revisions from the fair housing analysis, as well as our 2 rounds of HCD comments. And so we'll talk about some of those revisions here. The organization and structure of the housing element remain the same, just with adding on our Appendix F for fair housing. And a lot of the programs that were new coming out of that fair housing analysis did fall under our goal E that we have here, promote housing opportunities for all persons. But otherwise, the 6 goals remained unchanged as well. So looking at accommodating that RHNA allocation, I'll talk about the sites inventory first, then talk about a few programs. This sites inventory looks at various avenues of providing that RHNA capacity. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are one. They are projected over the 8-year cycle based on past trends. We have entitled and proposed projects. These are largely the specific plan areas that continue to build out. And then we have the remaining RHNA that must be solved through land inventory, your site inventory. And here we looked at available vacant land within the city, primarily looking at higher densities for addressing the moderate and low income categories. This shows, as you saw before, the city has a sufficient or actually substantial surplus in the moderate and above moderate categories, but a very slight shortfall, 49 units in lower income. The one change since the last draft is we were a little bit more conservative in some of our capacity projections for the moderate income sites. So that went slightly down, but we have such a large surplus there, it's not an issue. But the 49 unit shortfall in lower income, we have to address through a rezone program, and so that remains in place. Oh, excuse me. This site's inventory map is actually the same one that you saw before. This has not changed. This shows a large amount of capacity. Well, first I'll say the tan or brown identifies moderate income capacity sites. The blue identifies lower income capacity sites. And the state uses density as a proxy for determining affordability level. So this is not a back of the envelope financial feasibility analysis for affordability. This is purely based on what is the maximum allowed density in these zones. If it allows 30 units per acre as a maximum density, we can include that as a lower income capacity. So that's where you're seeing these sites designated. The moderate income capacity, as you know, we have vacant land in the urban village and vacant land in the kind of east downtown, the Xenia to Highland Springs area primarily. We see those sites, and then lower income, the blue, largely in the transit-oriented development overlay south of the 10. So when we talk about rezoning, addressing that 49-unit shortfall in lower income, since there is such a significant surplus in your moderate, we looked at taking some of those moderate income sites and just increasing the density on those. So where they allow 22 units today, increasing that to 30 units as a maximum density to allow those sites to be recategorized into the lower income bucket. And the sites identified for rezoning are in the east downtown area, primarily between Xenia and Highland Springs. And again, this is just a rezoning change to ensure that 49-unit shortfall is addressed. And one thing to note, considering fair housing, is that this area is considered a high resource area, at least in the opportunity maps issued this year in 2022. So it's looked upon favorably to be rezoning areas that are identified as high resource for lower income to provide a high quality environment for lower income capacity. So getting into some of the programs here, following along with that rezone requirement, the first program we have is rezoning. And while the shortfall is only 49 lower income units that would necessitate rezoning of 2.5 acres, a larger number of units in areas is identified for rezoning, and there's a reason for that. The city has to ensure that throughout the 8-year planning period, that sufficient capacity remains available for the remainder of your RHNA capacity. So at all times during the 8-year period, you must make sure that that adequate capacity is maintained. So what that means is that if one of these lower income sites gets developed with a market rate development, you need backup sites so that lower income capacity still remains available throughout the planning period. So there is additional land being identified to rezone. That way the city doesn't have to come back halfway through the cycle and rezone, find more sites to rezone. So this takes care of it at the outset, so you ideally don't have to worry about it throughout the whole 8-year cycle. The parameters of the rezone program are coming straight out of state law in terms of what must be required on these sites. Must allow 100% residential, and in mixed use, you must require 50% of a mixed use project to have 50% of that floor area to be residential. The minimum densities program, with the rezone program, this actually only applies to a few sites. And this just ensures that any sites identified as a housing element site does have a standard for a minimum density applied to it. So this would only apply to a few of the downtown sites that aren't proposed to be rezoned for lower income. Some additional programs include the accessory dwelling units program. This is to update the city's code to ensure that the ADU provisions are compliant with state law. That new chapter proposed for your zoning code is included in your packet, and that reflects the state law requirements for ADUs. And then additionally, preparing standard plans for ADUs. So building permit ready plans that folks could use to construct or apply for a building permit for an ADU. So the cities, we've been working with the city on those, and those should be ready quite soon. So that's really exciting. Density bonus programs. As part of the packet tonight too, you have modifications to the density bonus provisions in your zoning code to ensure compliance with state law. One of the issues here is that the legislature continues to amend provisions related to density bonus and other housing items. And so ensuring that the zoning code is kind of flexible and refers back to state law as needed to ensure that there isn't a conflict there. And then the city's code does have the flexibility to allow the city to authorize a density bonus greater than that allowed by state law. Those are, flexible case by case that can be decided whether or not that's appropriate to issue. But the city does provide flexibility for that. So we're proposing to retain that in place and see how that proceeds over this housing element cycle to see if any other tweaks to that might be appropriate to facilitate housing. Mixed use parking incentives. The parking management master plan just completed last year, I believe, had identified reduced parking rates for downtown. So we have included those in the zoning amendments so that projects in downtown are subject to those lower parking requirements. So with the intent of facilitating investment, mixed use housing in downtown. And an objective design standards program. So state law, Housing Accountability Act, Housing Crisis Act are looking at, really limiting the amount of subjectivity and discretion that is applied to housing development projects. And so the city will move forward with objective design standards for residential and mixed use project to provide that kind of those objective criteria for review and approval of residential projects. So that is something that is in LWC's contract. We are working on that, and we'll continue that work, get back to that work after the housing element is adopted. So you'll see that in the future. Now, here are a few programs that came specifically from the fair housing analysis. And there are others, and again, there are existing programs that were bolstered from that analysis as well, but just a few to highlight here, is targeting housing in high resource areas. So across the sites inventory, there are sites located in high or moderate resource areas, and this program has the city focusing on outreach and information being provided to the owners of the sites in high resource areas to encourage housing to be developed there. Implementation of the city's health and environmental justice element of the general plan. That is a recently adopted element that has a lot of good programs to deal with some of the environmental conditions and concerns shown for like the El Barrio neighborhood and town center areas. So continuing to implement those programs to deal with certain things like in terms of like lead abatement and idling ordinances and other vehicular emission reduction actions. And then lastly, a program specific to the El Barrio neighborhood in terms of working with those residents to identify improvements to Rangel Park. So not only working with them to identify those improvements, but allocating funding and making improvements to that park for the benefit of that community. So wrapping up, there are these additional actions. We've got the housing element update as our main show, but we do have some critical items for implementation, which is actually, it's quite efficient and it's, nice to be doing this as a whole, which is these zoning amendments that implement many of your housing element programs. There are only a few mentioned here in the presentation, but there are quite a few programs that are just required for compliance with state law. So we're taking care of a lot of those to get them off your plate early. There's also an amendment to the land use element just for consistency related to the rezoning for the lower income shortfall. The safety element updates also triggered by the housing element, focused on emergency access, egress, climate change related, as well as strengthening of policies and programs. And then finally, you've got the EIR addendum to cover this whole slew of work, identifying that there isn't any additional impacts outside of the EIR prepared for your general plan update. So no new mitigation measures or issues to consider there. And with that, the recommendation is a recommendation to council to adopt the housing element and the remainder of these items to move forward. That council hearing is slated for September 20th. Now, after that hearing, what happens is we submit that adopted housing element back to HCD. HCD, again, has another 60-day clock to review that and issue a letter to us. We do expect that to be a letter certifying the housing element as compliant. Worst case, we may have some minor modifications or tweaks just to address with them. But we're really, we think the housing element is in very good shape. We've been working with HCD on 14 housing elements this cycle, so we do expect a compliance letter or only minor changes. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to me, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Jen. That was excellent. Like Jen said, we're happy to answer any questions you have, either her or staff. Turn it over to the commission.
Thank you again for the report. Is there any discussion or questions?
Yes. This could be for staff or Jen. Thank you. The area between, for rezoning between Xenia and, how do you say that, Allegheny? What is it, how many units or, the density, what is it approved for now? And then what are we adding potentially?
Christina, I'm sorry, just because I'm not there. Would you like me to answer that?
You can, yeah, I was trying to pull up the chart, but if you have it on hand, go for it.
Well, so the maximum density in that zone now is a maximum density of 22 units per acre. And so the rezoning program would establish a maximum of 30 units per acre, as well as a minimum of 20 units per acre. Those are thresholds that the state has established for the rezoning program.
So I heard a number 49. I don't know if that was part of that. I took note of lower income and then adding 49 additional units.
So there was a
shortfall?
A shortfall. Okay. So the rezoning or the allowance of increasing that zoning allows for us to accommodate and meet that shortfall, so we can show the state that we can accommodate what they're requiring of us.
So I understand we have to just identify these areas, not necessarily build and
Right.
That sort of thing, but taking into consideration the traffic there right now with the school is already busy in the mornings and afternoons, and adding that element of a lot more cars, school kids, danger, that sort of thing. Can we, down the road, condition a project to help mitigate those concerns if they come up?
We can only require mitigation that it meets a nexus for the project, so that the project would only be required to mitigate for their impacts. So we wouldn't be able to ask them to go above and beyond because then they're paying more than their fair share for the improvements.
It's just a little concerning, I'm concerned with, the traffic and safety there already, and adding more units there, I'm not sure is the best option at this time.
All right, I do have a question as well. Just again with the density, because is there a through street in between the parcel like 031 and 005? Are we planning to add a through street or?
So no, there's no street identified down there or the circulation element. It would be something that would be analyzed if a project was submitted, say for those three parcels, 31 and 35 and 34, on how they would provide adequate circulation. And again, they would have to do a traffic analysis to address their traffic impacts.
And that would go through just plan check, or that would go through to us? And on the 49 shortfall, is that units or is that sites needed?
Just units. So 49 units total that we needed to accommodate.
Have we looked into as far as like sewer wise and being able to connect the sewer? Because I know on parcels, I believe is the ending 020 and 019. I want to say that I had a gentleman approach me about these parcels here, and they were saying that I guess connectivity with the sewer was just kind of like almost nearly impossible, but I'm not sure. I don't know if it was just commenting or something factual.
There is some history with the parcels along 8th Street there, not being connected to sewer. There is ability to be connected, and any project that would come through would be required to connect to the sewer.
So there is ability to be able
Oh,
to.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So currently the shortfall is 49. What's the projection? Is there a projection for the 8 years out, 2029, 2030? Of how
A
many would be
shortfall?
Yeah. what
No,
would-
this covers us through 2029. So the 49 shortfall that's being addressed through some of the rezoning allowances that are proposed would cover us through the whole planning period. So we don't anticipate any further shortfall.
Okay. And so the rezoning area, that's just kind of like, in case a project doesn't come through, basically.
Yeah, and it essentially works almost like an overlay. So the zoning is still what it is, but these parcels will be identified in the housing element as parcels that are eligible or that have that additional density or that additional zoning allowance to accommodate.
And we just have to give the opportunity to rezone, but
Yep, so if someone came in and they wanted to build on one of the identified parcels, we run through the typical planning processes, and it's a very common question developers ask, how many units per acre can we get? Whether it's single family or multifamily, it's the same question. And so we would let them know, you can go up to 30 units per acre. And again, there are additional density bonus programs if they meet, certain other requirements and whatnot. But we would provide them the information from the housing element.
is there a penalty if we don't meet this law?
So that's kind of a loaded question. So at the state level, we monitor legislation related to this very carefully because there has been a lot of discussion with housing being such a priority at the state level that let me go back and say the short answer is not right now. There is not a penalty at this point in time. I know there was legislation proposed over the last couple years that if cities don't make progress on their RHNA, on their required housing, or if they don't have a compliant housing element, there's been all kinds of things proposed as far as penalties, linking it to state funding, Measure A funding here, that which is transportation dollars, other types of penalties per unit or whatever. No legislation made it through this session that would cause cities to incur a penalty, but will it come up again? I'm positive that we'll see it come up again in the next legislative cycle.
Do we need all these sites to be amended, or so we could be compliant, or could we choose different sites? Just because the ones that are right on Sixth Street, I'm like just keep thinking, I'm like just because there's a lot of people drive super fast through that street there, and I'm like thinking, I'm like if kids or I'm like how are they gonna be hanging out or crossing that street or trying to get to Food for Less or
Right.
I doubt they'll walk all the way to Highland Springs and so just the ones right on 6th Street, I mean I would be okay with 31, 18 and 27, 22 and the ones that look more residential to me. I feel those would be more practical to be state commercial or something. But I'm not sure if we need all the sites to be amended.
Yeah, Jen, I don't know if you want to speak more to that, Jen. I know having the densities applied across all of the parcels gives us flexibility as staff, because what if someone came in on one of them and they did market rate, we would then have other options still that would keep us compliant. The ones that front 6th Street are already zoned mixed use. So we anticipate that, again, 50% would be residential, and the other 50% would be commercial. I doubt that we would see, well, I mean, I suppose we could see something come in totally residential, but those ones are not intended, I think, for just some of the reasons that you stated. The idea of having on 6th Street mixed use, put the commercial out front along the street and the residential in another part of the property.
And I'll just add to that, Christina, thank you, is that, this does provide more than enough surplus. The state does recommend that you have a buffer, that you provide more capacity than just meeting your RHNA. Right now, we have a table identified for the rezone sites that does total 479 units. So there is additional capacity there, more than the 49 shortfall plus a reasonable buffer. I mean, there is additional capacity there, but many communities are trying to get this surplus as large as possible to avoid having to reopen sites analysis partway through the housing element cycle and dealing with rezoning at that time. So it's up to the city. I mean, it's the city's prerogative to decide how much or how little to rezone, but the less you rezone, the more potential there is for having to come back to this partway through the cycle.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
On page 354 is the fire map. And so my question is to the high-risk fire area. How many sites or acres have we identified in that area? And is that the best choice for, I mean, will anyone even build more in that area?
Let me get to that page here.
All right.
So in that area, that is primarily the south end of the city. The areas within the city right now in that, can we, is there a way to bring that map up on
Yeah, what?
I mean,
page 354 in the staff report?
If you pull it up on the laptop in front of you,
Okay.
we can switch the input.
Oh, is it? Oh, yay, thank you, perfect. So the, okay. the south end of the city, all that red there is generally speaking outside of the city. So it's in our sphere, with the exception of on the east side, you see in the boundary how it kind of widens out on the bottom. That's all designated in the general plan essentially as open space. So there would be no housing identified there. Within the city boundary on, west of there, what's in the high fire hazard severity zone is industrial. So you'll recognize that area as Amazon and Hidden Canyon and those properties. The sphere outside of that does have some residential potential in that. There are bands of it that run in the sphere. That would be assessed at the time that somebody would want to annex in. It's not something that, honestly, from a staff perspective, that we anticipate it being truly built out as residential. I think it would be a very heavy lift for that, especially because since our general plan was adopted, some of the high fire severity guidelines through the state have changed. So just in that short 1.5-year time period, I think it would pose some it would pose some challenges to develop residential. What you see on the north end, that's all essentially outside of the city boundary, with the exception of that far northeast corner that's in the orange, and that's in our sphere, I believe. And then the rest of the red up there is the Cherry Valley area. So you recognize that as being outside of our city boundaries. So there is not much, if any at all, residential that's identified in those zones.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Questions? No. Okay? I will open the public hearing at 6:57. Do we have any public comments?
Rudy, do we have any callers on the line?
We have one caller on the line.
Okay, go ahead and put them through. Caller, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead. If you have the
Hi.
YouTube audio, I'm sorry, if you have the YouTube audio playing in the background, you'll just need to mute it.
I've done that. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Hi. My name's Catherine Brzezowski. I've participated in the majority of this housing element process, including speaking with you in the past, speaking at City Council, speaking with the State Housing and Community Development Department. My conversations with the state was referenced in a letter from Housing and Community Development to the City of Beaumont in review of your housing element. I have worked in philanthropy for 30 years with over 10 years of experience working on affordable housing. I have repeatedly elevated concerns about the housing element process with state senators who are in conversation directly with HCD Director Gustavo Velasquez. I've spoken to David Zisser, Director of Housing and Community Development Accountability, specific to your plan, and will continue to do so. Beaumont's housing element strategy is reusing units from housing element 4 and 5 and proposing rezoning 12 sites from those plans to meet your lower income RHNA thresholds. California housing element law requires if you're recycling a significant number of units and increasing the potential density, you need to explicitly demonstrate how these are viable projects. Can you specifically state what is the element that these 12 parcels that you're rezoning will now come to fruition? Why do you expect these will get developed when they haven't since 2006 during cycles 4 and 5 of your housing element? Have you proven developer interest? That needs to be in this plan. In your own evaluation of your fifth housing element, objective number 11 was that the city would, quote, survey affordable housing developers to encourage developers to address Beaumont's housing needs. You say this action item is ongoing, and yet I quote page 243, no formal outreach to affordable housing developers has been conducted, end quote. Our family owns 6.83 acres of vacant land in the town center at Pennsylvania and 11th, Michigan and 11th, and 12th between Pennsylvania and Michigan. We've presented a solution to the City of Beaumont in working with you to identify a mutually agreeable strategy in providing lower income housing. We are in conversation with senior affordable housing organizations, yet the conversation is stunted when they ask why the property isn't included in your housing element. Our property is on a bus line, already has water and infrastructure. Our ability to develop 1, 2, or 3 of our vacant parcels could quickly allow Beaumont to achieve notable wins with your housing element. Rather than needing to prove evidence that your recycled lots can be included, we can help you get ahead of your RHNA goals for low-income housing. We are asking to be included. In strategy 32 and 33 on page 148, the city is looking to pay large amounts of money to conduct technical and spatial analysis to determine underutilized properties that may be suitable for lower and moderate income housing development. Affirmative furthering fair housing mandates that affordable housing be located throughout the community. As shown on page 337, you have no units proposed in the town center. You've congregated all low-income sites in 3 communities. We ask to be included in your inventory now and are open to working with the City of Beaumont and will develop in a manner aligned with your goals in this plan as a way that's effective and saves the city resources. I hope you're able to gauge that I am well-versed in affordable housing, I understand housing elements, and I will continue to be in conversation with Chelsea Lee, your HCD lead, HCD director, HCD accountability office, and state senator. Thank you very much.
Rudy, do we have any other callers on the line?
We have no other callers on the line.
No other comments?
I will close public comment hearing at 7:02.
So if the commission has no further questions or comments, the recommended actions, there are a number of recommended actions included on page 11 of or at the end of the staff report. And they all basically, staff is requesting that you forward recommendations of approval to City Council for each of the items that are listed there, which would be recommending adopting the addendum to the general plan program environmental impact report, approval of the housing element, approval of the updated safety element, approval of the land use element amendments, adoption of the general plan to incorporate those items, adoption of a general plan amendment to incorporate those items, and then adoption of the zoning overlays to allow the higher density, and then adoption of the associated zoning code amendments, which would include the ADU ordinance and those items. Several of the items that Jen mentioned in her presentation will come back to planning commissions, such as the objective design guidelines and a few other items that will trail this particular document. And as Jen said, we are trying to get this into the state so that we can close the loop and receive our letter of certification. So those are staff's recommendations. And again, we're happy to entertain any further comments or discussions at the commission's wishes.
For the caller, I just wanted to say thank you for calling in. Is there, I guess, later after if we were to move or disapprove, for her parcels to be included later if they wanted to change? Because I guess those would be residential personally. I think 11th Michigan, 12th Michigan, and those are just.
Yeah. The reason staff chose not to include those or not recommending including those is because those parcels are solidly surrounded by single-family residential. Most of them are single-story homes in that area. It's much lower density than even in like Sundance or Fairway Canyon. And so allowing for increased density, we thought would not be the most appropriate, considering there are a number of other locations that could have the density without impacting the older single-family homes like we see in the core of town. Staff does not need them. As you see, not only were we able to allow for rezoning of the 49 units, but we have 400 plus additional units that can still be accommodated, so we have some flexibility. There is the opportunity to do senior or any other type of low-income housing on those properties. It's just a matter of the format in which they're done. So instead of doing a 30 dwelling units to an acre in the middle of a single-family residential neighborhood, it would be more suited for, duplexes, triplexes, single-story scale, something in line with what is currently existing in the neighborhood.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do we have a motion?
I'll motion to approve the project.
So this is
Staff
a,
recommendation.
to forward the recommendations?
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
So we have a motion and a second for the
I'll do roll call if you're ready.
roll call.
Commissioner Stevens?
Yes.
Commissioner Bedoya?
Yes.
Vice Chair Calindres?
Yes. Do we have any community development director comments?
Just briefly, thank you all for listening to the presentation tonight and your recommendation to council. We're doing our best to meet what the state wants us to do and make sure we keep the city compliant. On another note, we are experiencing a lot of activity in the downtown area. And staff has released an RFP, a request for proposals for a downtown revitalization plan. So we should be having hopefully a good number of proposals come in. That closes in a few weeks in September. And then we'll be having someone on board to help staff navigate and the business owners, obviously, to navigate that process. There are a number of program ideas for downtown businesses that were presented at the last Economic Development Committee meeting. And we're going to have a downtown business meeting. I'm not sure. I think Anthony was there at the last one that we did out at Craft. Well, we didn't do downtown businesses came together and city participated out at Craft Lounge. We're going to be hosting another one of those at Craft Lounge on September 14th. And so commission is welcome to attend, invite any business owners or community members that might have an interest in downtown. Staff is going to be going through the proposals for the types of programs that we've come up with based on feedback we've heard already, but also looking for input from the business owners and other people interested in what's happening in the downtown so that we can keep this moving along to council and get some of these programs in place to start stimulating some more activity in the downtown. That's primarily handled through our economic development and planning departments. So we welcome everybody there. There should be some formal social media and mail and stuff like that going out in the very near future. Other than that, I anticipate we will have our regularly scheduled meeting in September, which is the 13th. And we'll have a few items for you there. And other than that, anything? Nope. Okay. I think that's it for me.
So this meeting will be adjourned at 7:09. Thank you guys again for the participation.